The morning Elijah Crawford rode onto the Carver homestead, he had every intention of being cold about it, businesslike. But the smell of fresh bread stopped his horse at the gate, and for a long moment he simply sat there in the saddle like a man who had forgotten where he was going. It was the spring of 1874, deep in the Texas Panhandle, and the land was doing that particular thing it did in April where it made promises it had no intention of keeping. The grasses were green, the sky was the color of a blue glass bottle held up to sunlight, and the creek that cut through the southern edge of his property, the property that now included the 40 acres on which this small but tidy homestead sat, was running clear and cold with snowmelt from up north. Everything looked like a beginning. Elijah Crawford had come to deliver an ending. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that hard work and irregular meals made a man lean, with dark hair that had grown too long over the winter and hands that were cracked at the knuckles from cold water and fence wire. He had inherited the Crawford ranch from his father 2 years prior, along with a ledger full of debts and a legal dispute over the eastern parcels that had taken 18 months and nearly all of his savings to resolve. He had won. He now owned, free and clear, every inch of land that his father's eye had once swept over from the ridge on Sunday mornings, including these 40 acres. Including the small house with the green door and the kitchen garden with the new seedlings poking through dark soil and the smell of bread coming through the open window. He had sent a letter. He had sent 2 letters. He had received no reply, which was why he was here in person, sitting on his horse at the gate, hat pulled low against the morning sun, trying to remember that this was a legal matter and not a personal one. The door opened before he had worked up the will to dismount. She came out onto the porch with a dish towel tucked into her apron and flour on her left forearm, squinting at him the way you squinted at something that might be trouble or might just be the sun. She was younger than he expected. He had imagined a widow in her 50s, or perhaps an elderly couple, but the woman who stood on that porch could not have been more than 26, with dark red hair pinned up in a practical knot and brown eyes that were, even from this distance, remarkably steady. She did not look afraid of him. She did not look particularly pleased to see him either. She looked the way a woman looked when she had seen trouble enough times that she had stopped being surprised by it and had simply started making plans. "You are Elijah Crawford," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. You have come about the land." "I have." She looked at him for a moment more, then looked down at the dish towel in her hands, and then she did something he had not anticipated at all. She stepped back to the door, held it open, and said, "Then come inside and sit down first. I will put coffee on." He opened his mouth. He had a sentence prepared, had been rehearsing it for 3 miles, a firm but fair statement about the legal particulars and a reasonable time frame for her to make arrangements. The sentence did not come out. What came out instead was the sound of him swinging down from the saddle and looping his reins over the fence post, because apparently his body had decided before his mind did that he was going inside to drink coffee with this woman. He did not finish his sentence. Not that morning. Not for a long while after. The kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and yeast and something herby that he could not name, drying in bundles from the ceiling beams. The table was scrubbed pine, worn pale in the center from years of use, set with 2 mismatched chairs that had clearly been repaired more than once. There was a shelf of books along the east wall, more books than he had seen in a private home outside of Amarillo, and a good iron stove, and curtains made from flour sacking that someone had stitched a border of blue thread along the hem. She set a cup in front of him and poured from the pot without asking how he took it, then sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and waited. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the flower on her arm. He looked at the books. "Ida Carver," he said finally, because he needed to say something. "That is right. Your husband, my husband, Thomas Carver, died 14 months ago." She said it plainly, without the particular flinch some people had when they spoke of the recently dead, but there was something in the way her fingers pressed against each other that told him the plainness cost her something. He was the one who homesteaded this claim in 1870. I have been here since 1871. We built the house together. Elijah looked around the kitchen again with different eyes. He had thought the flour sacking curtains were frugal. Now he understood they were careful. This woman had made a home out of necessity and pride and whatever materials were available to her, and she had done it well. "I know you sent letters," she said. I did not reply because I did not know what to say that would not sound like begging, and I do not beg. I was not asking you to beg. You were asking me to leave. She met his eyes, which amounts to the same thing when the place you are being asked to leave is the only thing you have. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The ceramic was warm and slightly rough, the kind of cup you bought at a general store rather than ordered from a catalog. "The land was never legally homesteaded under the Homestead Act," he said, because it was the truth, and the truth was what he had come here to say. "Your husband filed the claim, but the parcel overlaps with the original Crawford grant which predates the filing. The court agreed." I know what the court said. Her voice was still level. "I had a lawyer read the judgment to me in Tascosa last November. Mr. Aldridge on Merchant Street, who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke very slowly, as though he suspected I might not understand long words." A ghost of something moved across her face, not quite amusement, not quite bitterness, somewhere in between. I understood every word. Elijah found himself looking at her more carefully now. "Then you know the ruling stands." "I know the ruling stands." She picked up her own coffee cup. "I also know that you have not taken any legal action to remove me, despite the ruling being issued 5 months ago, which makes me wonder why you have come yourself, in person, on a Tuesday morning in April, instead of sending the sheriff." He did not have a good answer for that. The honest answer was that he had not been able to bring himself to send the sheriff, for reasons he had not examined too closely, because he suspected they would not reflect well on him as a practical man of business. The honest answer was that he had ridden out here 3 times before today and turned back twice on the approach, and that on the 3rd time he had made it as far as the gate before he smelled the bread. "I wanted to speak with you directly," he said. "And here we are," she said, "speaking directly." She set down her cup. "How long do I have?" The directness of it landed on him like a stone dropped in still water. He watched the ripples. "I was thinking not until the harvest," she said. "I have winter wheat in. I planted it myself in October. I did the plowing myself too, with a mule named Patterson who has opinions about everything and respects no one's schedule but his own. The wheat comes in July. If you let me stay through the harvest, I will go after without argument. I will even leave the door on its hinges, since the door was hung before the original Crawford grant was disputed, and I am not sure what belongs to whom." Elijah stared at her. He had expected grief or anger or pleading. He had prepared responses for all 3. He had not prepared a response for negotiation, offered quietly over coffee by a woman with flour on her arm who spoke about her mule's personality as though it were a relevant legal consideration. "Patterson," he repeated. "He has strong feelings about early mornings," she said. "I respect that in a mule." Something happened in his chest then, a sort of loosening, like a knot that has been pulled too tight for too long suddenly releasing one strand. He did not smile, quite, but it was close. "Through the harvest," he said slowly. "Through the harvest," she confirmed. "July if the rains cooperate, perhaps early August if they do not. I will not ask for more than that." He should have said yes immediately, or no, or asked for time to think. Any of those would have been the practical response of a man who had come here to settle a legal matter. Instead he heard himself say, "That wheat you planted, is it the red turkey variety?" She looked at him. "Yes. My father tried to grow that wheat for 3 years on the south acreage and could not get it to establish. He said the soil was too alkaline." "It can be," she agreed. "I used a bed of ash from the burn pile mixed with the bottom soil in October, took some of the alkaline edge off. There is a paper about it in the Kansas Farmer Journal from 1869. I have it on the shelf if you would like to see it." He looked at the shelf of books again. He thought about his father's 3 failed wheat seasons. He thought about the South acreage, which was still given over to grass because no one had solved the soil problem. He thought about a woman who read agricultural journals and kept them on her shelf next to what appeared to be a copy of Middlemark and a well-used Bible. "I would," he said, "if you do not mind." She got up and fetched it without comment, as though offering to show agricultural research to the man who had come to evict her was a perfectly ordinary thing to do. She set the journal open on the table in front of him and pointed to the relevant passage with a flour-dusted finger, and he leaned over to read it. And that was the morning that broke open something in Elijah Crawford that had been sealed shut for a very long time. He stayed for 2 hours that day. He told himself it was about the wheat. He rode back to the main Crawford Ranch house, a solid, stone-built structure 3 miles northwest, and spent the evening pretending to do accounts and actually thinking about red-haired women who negotiated with the calm precision of people who had decided they would not be afraid anymore. The Crawford Ranch ran about 4,000 acres total, with a crew of 6 hands who lived in the bunkhouse, and a woman named Mrs. Alvarez who came 3 times a week to cook and clean, and say plain-spoken things about the state of Elijah's life, in a way that made him uncomfortable enough to change his behavior. He had no family left except a younger brother named James, who was currently somewhere in Colorado doing something that Elijah preferred not to know the details of. He had been engaged once, to a woman named Catherine, but Catherine had found the isolation of the Panhandle too much to bear and had gone back to Fort Worth 2 years before his father died, and he had not blamed her particularly. There was something about this place that either suited a person completely or drove them to distraction, and he had always known that Catherine was the latter kind, even before she knew it herself. He did not let himself think that Ida Carver was clearly the former kind. That would have been premature and presumptuous and would not have served anyone. He went back on Thursday. He told himself it was to check on the wheat fields and confirm the timeline of the harvest, which was a plausible enough reason. He arrived at mid-morning and found Ida on the east side of the house, fighting with a length of fence wire while Patterson, the mule, stood nearby looking judgmental. "He pulled through it again," she said, without turning around, apparently having heard the horse coming up the track. "3rd time this week. I think he does it on purpose." "Does he do it for a reason?" Elijah dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post that was still standing. "He wants to be in the kitchen garden," she said, wrapping the wire around the post with practiced efficiency. "He discovered the parsley last fall and has had opinions about fences ever since." Elijah looked at Patterson. Patterson looked back at him with dark, patient eyes that did, in fact, suggest an animal with strong convictions. "I have a mule on the South Range," he said. "He is not interested in parsley. He is interested in kicking things." "Different temperaments," Ida said. She yanked the wire taut and twisted the end off with a pair of pliers. "There. That will hold for 2 days." She stood up and pushed a strand of hair out of her face. In the morning light she looked tired in a way that was not the tiredness of poor sleep, but of sustained effort, of being one person doing the work of 2 for a long time. "Did you come about the wheat?" "I came to see how things stood," he said, which was honest enough. She wiped her hands on her work skirt and looked at him with that measuring expression he was beginning to recognize. It was the look of a woman who had learned to take stock of people quickly because she could not afford to be wrong about them. "Things stand," she said. "Would you like coffee, if you are making it anyway? I am always making it." He helped her carry the remaining fence tools back to the small barn, a structure more accurately described as a large shed, with stalls for Patterson and the 2 horses she kept, a milk cow named Agnes who watched everything with mild disapproval, and a collection of tools hanging from the walls with the orderliness of someone who had thought carefully about where each thing should live. "You run all of this alone?" he asked, not meaning it as an accusation but aware it might sound like one. "I have help," she said. "A boy from the neighboring claim, Sam Birch's youngest, comes on Saturdays for the heavier work. He is 14 and strong and works for 50 cents and a meal." She hung the pliers on their hook. "It is enough." "It is a lot," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said after a moment. "It is a lot." They had coffee on the porch this time because the morning was warm enough and because the porch faced east and the light was good. He learned that she had grown up in Ohio, in a town called Millbrook that had once had ambitions and had since accepted its limitations. She had come to Texas with Thomas in 1871, following the promise of land and the belief that the distance between a person and their circumstances could be managed by changing geography. Thomas had been a good man, she said. She said it with the careful honesty of someone who loved someone and still saw them clearly. A good man who was not built for the Panhandle any more than Catherine had been built for it. Though in Thomas's case, the thing that broke him was not loneliness but the accumulated weight of drought and debt, and a winter fever in January of 1873 that took him in 5 days. "I am sorry," Elijah said. "He was 30 years old," she said, looking at the middle distance. "I have thought a great deal about what that means, whether it means something or whether it is just a thing that happened." She looked back at him. "I have not decided yet." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father died at 58. I thought I had more time with him. He thought I did too, I think. We were always going to have a conversation that we never had." "What kind of conversation?" he considered. "About whether I was doing this the right way. The ranch. The land. He built it one way and I am building it another, and I never got to know if he thought I was right to do it differently." He looked down at his coffee cup. "It is strange, the things you are left holding." She watched him. "Yes," she said, "it is." He came back on Saturday, ostensibly to speak with Sam Birch's son Henry about some fence work on the property line, which was a completely legitimate reason, and also not the real reason. The real reason was sitting in the kitchen garden with a seed packet in her hand and dirt on her knees, explaining to Henry that the tomatoes needed to go in the ground in 2 weeks and not before, because the night temperatures were still dropping and tomatoes were not philosophical about cold. Henry, who was 14 and strongly built, and seemed to regard the world with cheerful unconcern, noticed Elijah coming up the track and called out a greeting. Ida looked up from her seed packet and something crossed her face that he could not fully read, not quite surprise, not quite pleasure, something that she smoothed away quickly and replaced with her customary composure. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "Mrs. Carver," he said. "I had some questions about the east fence line." "Henry knows the fence line better than I do," she said. "He can walk you through it." So Henry walked him through it, talking the whole time with the relentless energy of a 14-year-old who was pleased to be consulted on something. And Elijah paid attention and asked sensible questions, and told himself that the reason he kept looking back toward the kitchen garden was because he was assessing the property, which was technically true and also not the point. At noon, Ida brought out bread and cheese and 3 tin cups of cold water from the well, and they sat on the edge of the wagon bed and ate, and Henry talked about his father's cattle, and a horse he was saving to buy, and a schoolteacher in Tascosa who he believed could explain mathematics better if she just tried harder. Ida listened with the patient attention of someone who genuinely liked the boy, asking questions at the right moments, laughing at the right things. She had a laugh that she kept fairly controlled most of the time, but occasionally something got through the control, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and Elijah found that laugh entirely disproportionate in how much it affected him. Henry left at 4. Elijah should have left at 3. He stayed instead, and helped Ida carry a load of split wood from the pile behind the barn to the woodbox beside the stove, and she let him do it with the matter-of-fact gratitude of someone who was used to doing it alone, but was not too proud to accept help when it was offered. They worked in comfortable silence, which surprised him. He had not expected silence to be comfortable with her, because she talked well enough that silence felt like an absence. But it turned out that her silences were as easy as her conversation, unhurried and without demand. When the woodbox was full, she made supper, because it was past 6 o'clock by then, and she simply started making it without asking if he was staying, which he found was both presumptuous and the most natural thing in the world. She made beans with salt pork and cornbread, and they ate at the pine table and talked about the wheat and about the south acreage on the Crawford ranch, and about whether the soil amendment she had used could be applied on a larger scale. She had thoughts on this, specific, well-considered thoughts, backed by the journal she fetched again from the shelf, and also by 3 years of practical experience on the specific kind of alkaline soil that characterized this part of the Panhandle. He found himself leaning forward across the table, his elbows on the scrubbed pine, listening with the particular quality of attention you gave to something that was going directly into the place where you were going to keep important things. "You could try it on the south acreage this fall," she said. "If the burn pile is large enough for the ash supply, you would need to know the soil depth on the problematic sections. Have you got a soil sample you have tested?" "My father had them tested in 1868, he said. "I have the results in the ledger box." "That is 6 years old," she said. "The soil shifts. You would want a new sample." "I could bring you the results," he said. "The ones from 1868, to compare." She looked at him steadily across the table. "You could," she said, and then, after a pause, "or you could bring the samples themselves and I could walk the south acreage with you." He went home in the full dark, under a sky that was doing its most extravagant spring display, and sat on the porch of the main ranch house and thought about a woman who had flour on her arm and agricultural journals on her shelf and a mule with a parsley problem, and who was living on land that was legally his, and who he had come to evict, and who had instead fed him beans and salt pork, and talked to him about soil alkalinity for 2 hours, and asked him to bring her soil samples. Mrs. Alvarez arrived on Monday morning and immediately said, "You have the look of a man who is in trouble." "I have the look of a man who needs to take soil samples," he said. "Same thing," she said, and started on the floors. He took the soil samples from the south acreage on Wednesday, 3 of them from the most problematic sections, labeled and wrapped in cloth in a small wooden box the way the agricultural bulletin recommended. He also spent Tuesday evening going through his father's files and finding the 1868 results, which he read with new attention, trying to see the soil through the lens of what Ida had told him. He rode out on Thursday. He had stopped pretending the visits had other purposes. She was at the creek when he arrived, the one that cut through the south edge of the property, washing something in the current with her skirt hitched up to her knees and her boots on the bank behind her, and she looked up when she heard the horse with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something warmer than her usual composure. "I was wondering when Thursday would bring you," she said. "Am I that predictable?" "You are consistent," she said, which he thought was more generous. She waded to the bank and sat down to put her boots back on, and he dismounted and sat on a flat rock nearby and opened the wooden box to show her the soil samples. She pulled on one boot, then leaned over to look at the samples, and he watched her examine them with a focused attention that he was beginning to think was characteristic of everything she did, as though she could not do something halfway even if she tried. "Yes," she said. "This one here, the middle one, this is the problem. You can see it, too pale." She looked up at him. He was very close because the samples were between them on the rock and they had both leaned in at the same moment, and for a second neither of them moved. Her eyes were not simply brown, he noticed from this distance. There was amber in them like light through creek water in late afternoon. She looked back down at the sample. "This can be fixed," she said. "It will take 2 seasons." "I have 2 seasons," he said. She put on her second boot and laced it, and then sat with her hands in her lap looking at the creek, and he sat on the flat rock with the soil samples between them, and the silence that settled was the kind that has weight, the kind you feel rather than simply occupy. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask it. When you decided to come here in person instead of sending the sheriff." She paused. "Was it because of the soil?" He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she kept her chin up even when she was uncertain. "No," he said, Not the soil. Was it because you felt guilty? He considered. Partly. And the other part, he was quiet for a moment. A red-winged blackbird landed on a reed at the water's edge and regarded them with skepticism before departing. The other part was that I have had 2 replies in 2 years to my letters from anyone at any distance that I actually wanted to read again, he said finally. My brother James wrote once from Denver, and then there was nothing. The land is quiet. It is the right kind of quiet for me mostly. But sometimes it is the wrong kind. He looked at the creek. I did not know why I kept turning my horse around before I got to your gate. I think I did not want it to be finished, whatever it was. She was very still beside him. Then she said, you had not even met me. No, he agreed. But the letters were yours, you could tell. She looked at him then fully for a long, steady moment. I was very angry in those letters, she said. I did not think they revealed much except that I had strong opinions about property law. They revealed that you were not afraid of your own mind, he said. That is more than most people manage. She looked back at the creek. He watched the color in her cheeks, which was not entirely from the spring wind. Elijah, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed differently than he expected, not casually, not carelessly, but with the precision of a person who had been saving it for the right moment. I think you should know that I am not a woman who will be managed. I am not a man who would try, he said. I think you should also know, she continued, that I have been thinking about you between Thursdays, which I find inconvenient. He did not say anything for a moment. The blackbird came back and landed in the same spot and reconsidered them a second time. I find it inconvenient too, he said. She laughed then, one of those real laughs that surprised it out of her, and turned to look at him with something unguarded and bright in her face, and he looked back at her in the afternoon light by the creek, and the feeling in his chest was like the knot releasing another strand, and another, until he was not sure there was any knot left at all. He did not reach for her hand. He was not that kind of man, to move before he knew the ground was solid. But when they rode back together toward the homestead, she had brought her horse, a bay gelding named Crocker, to ride out to the creek. They rode close enough that their knees nearly touched on the narrow track, and neither of them moved apart. May arrived with all its wind and its promises, and Elijah Crawford spent more of it at the Carver homestead than could be accounted for by soil samples or fence lines or harvest timelines. He started sending a hand over on Fridays, a young man named Des from the bunkhouse, who was 19 and good-tempered and strong, to help with the heavier work, which he framed as being in his own interest since the land was technically his, and he wanted it kept up. Des went without question, because Des was sensible and did not ask questions when the implied answer was obvious. He came back on Fridays reporting that Mrs. Carver was a serious person who worked hard and made good cornbread, and he seemed genuinely happy to be useful there, which resolved any guilt Elijah might have felt about sending him. The other hands noticed that their employer was riding east on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and occasionally Saturdays without particular explanation. They did not say anything directly, because Elijah Crawford ran a professional operation, and the hands were professional men, but there was a quality of contained amusement in the bunkhouse that he was not unaware of. His foreman, a man named Cutter Banks, who had ridden with him for 4 years and was therefore allowed opinions, said one evening over the fence rail, "That the widow on the east parcel." "Yes," Elijah said. "She's still there." "Yes. Thought you were going to sort that out in March." "I am working on it." Cutter Banks looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man choosing his battles. "Right," he said, and went back to the fence. It was not that Elijah had forgotten about the legal situation. He had not forgotten. He thought about it frequently, and it had a particular quality when he thought about it now, a tight, uncomfortable quality, like a boot that fit well enough when you were standing still but pinched when you walked. He owned the land. The court had been clear. Ida knew this, and she had not once, in all their conversations, pretended otherwise or tried to use what was growing between them as leverage against it. She had not brought it up again at all, in fact, after that first morning, which was either admirable restraint or strategic calculation, and he suspected strongly that it was the former, because everything he had learned about Ida Carver suggested that she was constitutionally incapable of operating through manipulation. She was capable of stubbornness, though. He learned this in the third week of May, when he arrived on Tuesday afternoon to find her trying to move a stone that was approximately the size and weight of a reasonable argument against moving it alone. "What are you doing?" he said. "Moving a stone," she said, with great dignity, covered in sweat and creek mud. "Why?" "Because it is in the way of where I want to put the second garden bed. It weighs 200 pounds. I am aware of what it weighs," she said. "I have been having a conversation with it about this for an hour." He dismounted, rolled up his sleeves, and moved the stone. She watched him do it with the expression of someone who had fully intended to do it herself, but was not foolish enough to refuse assistance. When it was done, she said, "Thank you," in a completely composed voice, as though he had handed her a book rather than moved a boulder. "You would have gotten it eventually," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "By Tuesday." He laughed. It surprised him. He did not laugh frequently or easily, and this came out free and sudden. And she looked at him when it happened with an expression that was warm and a little wondering, as though she was pleased to have been the cause of it. They planted the second garden bed together that afternoon, side by side in the dirt, and talked about his father's cattle operation and her grandfather's farm in Ohio, and the particular stubbornness that seemed to run in some family lines like a vein of ore through rock. The light went long and gold and horizontal, and Patterson hung his head over the barn fence and watched them with his usual judgmental attention, and Elijah thought that this was one of the finest afternoons he had spent in several years, which told him things about the last several years that he preferred not to examine. On the ride home, he made a decision. He let it sit overnight to make sure it was the right decision and not simply an impulsive one, and in the morning it was still there, solid and clear, so he acted on it. He rode to Tascosa on a Friday, not east to the homestead but northwest to town, and he went to the county land office and spent 2 hours going through the original documents of the Crawford grant. He talked to the land office clerk, a meticulous man named Oliver who had a memory for historical documents and a professional discomfort with imprecision, and then he rode to see a lawyer, not Mr. Aldridge, who smelled of pipe tobacco and spoke slowly, but a younger man named Garrett, who had come to Tascosa from Kansas City the previous year and had a reputation for thorough work. He was not sure when he set out exactly what he was looking for. He told himself he was reviewing the original grant for completeness. What he was actually doing, he admitted by the time he was sitting across from Garrett, was looking for whether the legal situation was truly as final as it had been presented, and whether there was any legitimate path that did not end with Ida Carver standing on the road outside the house she had built. Garrett spent 2 weeks on it. Elijah spent those 2 weeks going to the homestead on Tuesdays and Thursdays and not saying anything about the legal review, because he did not want to give her hope he was not certain he could deliver, and because he found, somewhat to his own astonishment, that he had started thinking about the situation in terms that went beyond the legal. The situation, put plainly, was this. He was falling in love with Ida Carver. He had been falling in love with her since the morning she had asked him to sit down and put the coffee on, and the fall had been so steady and so natural, like a creek finding its course downhill, that he had not noticed the velocity of it until he looked back at where he had started and saw how far he had come. He was not a man who was careless with such realizations. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned over anything important. He examined his motives, because the worst thing he could imagine was that he was falling in love with her as a means of resolving a legal inconvenience, and he needed to be certain that was not what this was. It was not what this was. He knew this because the legal situation and the feeling in his chest were entirely separate problems, and the feeling in his chest would have been exactly the same if she had been living on a parcel of someone else's land entirely. He also examined the question of what he had to offer her, which felt less certain. He had the ranch, which was profitable now and likely to be more so if the south acreage could be made productive. He had the stone house, which was solid and comfortable enough but not particularly warm in its furnishings, because he had never bothered with warmth in furnishings when he had no one to sit with him in the evenings. He had himself, which he attempted to assess honestly, 31, reliable, better at listening than talking, with strong opinions about soil and fence construction, and a tendency to ride east on Thursdays for reasons that were now essentially transparent to everyone who knew him. He had a conversation with Cutter Banks that was not really about the south acreage but used it as scaffolding. "If I were to plant wheat on the South 40, he said, leaning on the fence rail in the blue morning light, what would you say?" "I would say that you have never grown wheat on the South 40, Cutter said. "There is a method," Elijah said. "An ash amendment. It addresses the alkalinity." Cutter Banks looked at him for a long moment. "You are asking Mrs. Carver to stay," he said. "I am thinking about the south acreage." "You are thinking about her," Cutter said, with the bluntness that 4 years of shared work had bought him, "which is fine. She is clearly capable and you are clearly better company since March." He pushed off the fence. "Just do it right is all I am saying. She has had enough done wrong." Elijah thought about that for a long time. Garrett's report came on a Thursday, which meant Elijah read it in the morning and rode east in the afternoon with the paper folded in his breast pocket, and his thoughts moving at a pace that made the 15-minute ride feel like 4. The report confirmed what the court had found: the Crawford grant did take precedence. The homestead claim was not valid in the overlapping section, but it also included a paragraph about a legal instrument called a license to occupy, which Garrett had noted with characteristic thoroughness as a possible alternative to eviction. A license to occupy could be granted by a landowner to a resident on a fixed-term or permanent basis, conferring legal right of use without conferring title. It was not common on the frontier because it was a relatively formal instrument, but it was legally sound, and it was entirely within Elijah Crawford's power to grant one. He sat on the flat rock by the creek for a few minutes before going up to the house, reading the paragraph a third time, thinking about what he actually wanted to say. What he wanted to say was not a legal instrument. He knew that. But the legal instrument was the part he could say first, without overreaching, without presuming that what he felt was fully returned, or that she was ready to hear anything beyond a practical resolution to a practical problem. He went up to the house and knocked, and she came to the door with a book in her hand and her hair down, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. He had not seen her hair down before, and it changed the look of her significantly, made her seem younger and less guarded, and he had to make an effort to begin his sentence in the right place rather than simply standing at the door looking at her. "I have something to tell you," he said. She looked at the paper in his breast pocket, visible above his jacket lapel. "Come in and sit down," she said, which he appreciated for its echo, and stepped back from the door. He sat at the pine table. She sat across from him, put her book down, and folded her hands, and he took out Garrett's report and spread it on the table between them and explained it, slowly and completely, the way you explained something to someone who was intelligent enough to need all the details. She listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was her default mode with important information: receive it all first, respond after. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the paper without reading it. Then, "You hired a lawyer to look for a way I could stay." "I hired a lawyer to make sure I understood my options," he said. "Those are not different things," she said, and looked at him steadily. "Elijah, it is a formal instrument," he said. "It would give you legal right to live here and work the land. You would not own the title, but you would have security." For how long? This was the part where he had to be careful. He had thought about this. "That would depend," he said slowly, "on what you wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was coming through the flour sack curtains with their careful stitched borders, doing something warm and particular to the air. "What do you want?" she asked. It was a very direct question, delivered in a very steady voice by a person who he understood was not asking about the legal instrument. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to know if you would permit me to call on you properly, with your full awareness of what I would mean by that." Another silence. He watched her face, which was doing something complicated and careful, and he waited, because this was not a moment to fill with noise. "I think," she said at last, "that I have been permitting you to call on me since the first Thursday in April, and that you have been aware of what it meant, and that I have been aware of what it meant, and that we have both been very sensible about not saying so." A pause. "I am not sure how much more sensible I can be." He felt the last strand of the knot give way entirely. "Then I will stop being sensible," he said. She laughed again, the real laugh, sudden and warm, and reached across the pine table and put her hand over his just briefly, just for a moment, before drawing it back. But the touch was there, clear and certain, and it said everything the whole spring had been building toward. June came in hot and full of thunder, the way June in the Texas Panhandle did when it was trying to make a point. The wheat in the east field stood shoulder high and the color of old gold, and Elijah Crawford spent more of June at the Carver homestead than at the main ranch, which was a fact that ceased to require explanation for anyone and was instead simply the way things were. He was not a man who moved quickly by nature. He had considered every major decision of his life with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned early that haste was expensive. But Ida Carver had a quality that made him want to be more certain, faster about things, because there was a quality in being near her that felt like being in a place where time was useful rather than merely passing. He was not entirely sure how to articulate this even to himself. What he knew was that when he was at the main ranch house in the evenings, he was occupying it, and when he was at the kitchen table in the Carver homestead, he was inhabiting something. He started bringing things with him on Tuesdays. Not gifts exactly. He was cautious about gifts, about what they implied before he had asked anything formally, but useful things. A new hinge for the barn door he had noticed was working loose, a jar of good coffee from the store in Tascosa, a length of good fence wire for the section Patterson had destroyed again. She accepted all of these with the same graceful practicality, neither making too much of them nor making too little. On a Sunday in late June, he had never come on Sundays before. She was sitting on the porch in the early morning with her Bible open in her lap, not reading but looking at the wheat fields, and he rode up, and she looked at him coming up the track with an expression that was simply and clearly glad, and he thought he had not been looked at with that expression in a very long time, if ever. He sat beside her on the porch steps. She did not move her Bible to make more room, which meant they were close on the step, close enough that her shoulder was near his arm. They sat like that and watched the wheat in the morning light, and it was very quiet except for the creek and the birds and the occasional distant sound of something happening on the open range. "My father's father built the original Crawford house in 1849, he said, out of what felt like a need to give her something that was genuinely his. He came from Georgia. He had a wife and 3 sons and a wagon full of tools and the specific certainty that God had placed exactly this parcel of land in this part of Texas for exactly this family. He was not a humble man, my grandfather." "Was your father humble?" "He was honest," Elijah said, "which I think he found served better." He looked at the wheat. He would have appreciated that field. He would have tried to take credit for it, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with a carefully composed expression that was not quite hiding a smile, and he felt the particular pleasure of being teased by someone who knew him well enough to do it precisely. He would have, Elijah agreed. He was that kind of honest. She smiled fully and let it stay this time instead of putting it away. He watched it and thought about the afternoon at the creek, and the hand over his on the pine table and the whole long spring of Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he thought that it was time to be less sensible. "Ida," he said. "Yes." I have been circling something for 3 months, and I believe you know what it is, and I am going to say it plainly now, if you will permit me." She closed the Bible on her lap. "I will permit you," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very certain. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been in love with you since some time in April, possibly the day with the stone, possibly earlier. I am not a man who says this kind of thing without meaning it entirely, and I want you to know that I mean it entirely." He paused. "I would like to ask you to marry me. Not because of the land, which I intend to sign over to you regardless, and not because you need protection, because you are clearly capable of protecting everything important without my assistance, but because I want to be in the same house as you in the evenings, and because your laugh is the best sound I have heard in 4 years, and because I have never met anyone whose mind I wanted to talk to for the rest of my life until I met yours." She was quiet. He waited because she always needed a moment with important things, and he had learned that her silences were not hesitation but preparation. "You are going to sign over the land regardless," she said. "Yes." "Even if I say no to the rest?" "Yes." She looked at the wheat. A breath of morning wind came through the field and moved it, and the sound was like a whisper going over a long distance. "I have not been planning to love anyone else," she said. "After Thomas, I had decided it was an inefficiency I could not afford." She paused. "You have been thoroughly inconvenient in this regard." "I know," he said. "I find I do not mind," she said, and turned to look at him fully, and her eyes in the morning were clear and warm and entirely certain. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. I will also hold you to the part about my mind, because I have strong opinions about many things and I intend to express them." "I am counting on it," he said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it in the morning sun on the porch steps, and they sat like that for a while without needing to be anywhere else. They married in September after the harvest. The wheat came in the first week of August, good wheat, the red turkey heads fat and heavy, and Elijah brought the whole Crawford crew out to help with the cutting and the thrashing. And it became the kind of day that people talked about afterward with the particular warmth of something that was both work and celebration. Mrs. Alvarez came and made enough food for 12 people, which was the right amount because there were 11, and Cutter Banks said 3 words about the quality of the wheat that constituted, from him, a genuine speech. Henry Birch worked alongside the Crawford hands all day without distinction, and at the end of it announced to no one in particular that he intended to be a rancher, which seemed to everyone present to be a sound vocational decision. Patterson, the mule, was confined to his stall during the harvest because his feelings about the wheat situation were unclear, and his capacity for disruption was not. The wedding itself was small, because Elijah had no family present. James sent a letter from Colorado that arrived 2 days after, which was characteristic of James, and Ida had no family within 1,000 miles, and both of them were people who preferred substance over ceremony. They were married by the circuit pastor in Tascosa on the 2nd Saturday in September, with Cutter Banks and Mrs. Alvarez as witnesses, and Des from the bunkhouse, who had asked very politely if he could come, and whom no one had the heart to refuse. Ida wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she ordered from a catalog in July, and she wore her hair pinned up with 2 ivory combs that had belonged to her mother. And when she walked in and stood beside him at the front of the small church, Elijah looked at her and thought that there was not a more particular or more honest person on the face of this earth, and that he was the most fortunate man he knew. They rode back to the homestead together that afternoon, because it was Ida who had suggested they stay there rather than moving immediately to the main ranch house, and Elijah had agreed without question, because the main ranch house had everything needed and nothing wanted, and the Carver homestead had the flour sack curtains with the stitched borders and the shelf of books and the smell of bread and the feeling of being inhabited rather than merely occupied. "We will need to think about the 2 properties," Ida said, practical to the last possible moment. They were riding side by side on the track, their horses easy in the September afternoon. "We have time," he said. "There is no reason to maintain two separate households," she said. "It is inefficient." "We will think about it in October," he said. She considered this. "October is acceptable," she said. Then, with the smile she had stopped putting away, "as long as you know I am not leaving Patterson." "I would not ask you to leave Patterson," he said. "He and I will have to come to an arrangement." "He will need to be consulted," she said seriously. "Obviously," he agreed. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the September air and became part of the afternoon, and he rode beside his wife through the last of the harvest light, and felt the fullness of it settle around him like something he had not known he had been waiting for. October brought the question of the two households to the table, as promised, and the answer they came to working it through over several evenings at the pine table with a lamp between them. The way they worked through everything important was that the main ranch house was larger and more practical for a working ranch operation, and that they would move the main residence there before winter. But they would keep the homestead. Elijah signed the deed to it in Ida's name, 40 acres, clear title, hers which he had promised and which Garrett drew up with professional satisfaction, noting that it was one of the more pleasant instruments he had been asked to prepare. The homestead became the place where Ida kept her garden and her journals and did her best thinking, and where she went on Tuesday mornings to be alone with the good quiet. And Elijah learned to understand this about her and found he respected it entirely. She was a woman who needed both the shared life and the interior one, and he was a man who could give her both without feeling the loss of either. The main ranch house changed, that winter, in ways that were difficult to articulate but obvious to anyone who walked through the door. The flour sack curtains did not come, those stayed at the homestead where they belonged, but the books came, and a second chair appeared by the fireplace that was clearly positioned for reading, and the kitchen smelled different because Ida cooked differently than Mrs. Alvarez, not better or worse but more intentional, as though every meal was a decision made by someone who had thought about what nourishment actually meant. Mrs. Alvarez, for her part, came on Mondays and Wednesdays now instead of 3 days a week, and the two women had established by November a working relationship of mutual respect and occasional argument that seemed to suit them both perfectly. December was cold and clear, the kind of cold that came down from the northern plains and made the sky look like beaten silver. They spent most evenings by the fire, and Elijah learned that Ida read in a way that made her completely inaccessible, which was fine because he had learned to take a book himself when she was reading, and there was a very particular pleasure in the two of them being unreachable together. She told him things about Thomas that winter slowly, in pieces, in the way that you give someone an important history when you have decided to trust them with it fully. Thomas had been good and struggling, she said. He had been a man who wanted to be the thing the frontier asked him to be and could not quite get there, and that gap, between who he wanted to be and what he could manage, had ground him down slowly before the fever finished it. He was not unhappy, she said carefully. I want to be clear about that. We were not unhappy together. But we were two people trying to make a life in a place that one of us was suited for and one of us was not, and that puts a strain on things that is hard to account for. Were you happy? Elijah asked. She thought about it seriously. I was useful, she said, which for a long time was what I needed happiness to be. She looked at the fire. I think I did not know the difference until recently. He moved his chair closer to hers just slightly. She did not remark on it, but she shifted her book to her other hand so that the hand nearest him was free, and he took it, and they sat like that in the firelight while the wind moved around the corners of the stone house. Cutter Banks got married in February to a woman from Tascosa named Dora Hedges who had grown up in the area and who regarded the entire Crawford operation with a proprietary pride that she had apparently been harboring quietly for years. This was a source of great satisfaction to everyone, because Dora Hedges was formidable and efficient, and the bunkhouse had been developing bad habits in the catering department. Spring came around again, and with it the second year of the wheat experiment, this time on the South 40 of the Crawford Ranch. The problem acreage, the alkaline sections that Elijah's father had never solved. Ida walked it with him in March, taking her own soil samples with a precision that the hands observed with considerable respect, and she worked out the ash amendment requirements on the basis of the new samples and the 1868 comparison and the Kansas Farmer Journal, which she had brought with her in her coat pocket. The planting went in April, and Elijah did it alongside the hands, following the method Ida had written out in precise detail in the ranch ledger, and it was the first time wheat had been planted on the South 40 in 6 years. The crew approached it with a mixture of skepticism and investment that resolved, as the weeks passed and the seedlings came up green and steady, into something approaching proprietary pride. "She was right about the ash," Des reported one morning with the expression of a man who had been converted to a faith. "She usually is," Elijah said, and did not say it with any surprise. In late April, on a warm evening when the South 40 was showing a solid stand of young wheat, and the whole ranch had the feeling of a year going well, Ida told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, standing at the stove, not looking at him, in the carefully composed voice she used for important things. He had been sitting at the table doing accounts, and he put down the pen immediately and stood up and came to where she was, and turned her gently by the shoulders so she was facing him, and she met his eyes with an expression that was a complex mixture of things joy and fear, and the particular uncertainty of someone who has been through enough to know that joy is not always uncomplicated. "Are you all right?" he asked. It was the right question, he thought. Not congratulations, not excitement, but "Are you all right?" Something in her face eased. "I think so," she said. "I am glad." She paused. "I am also frightened. That is allowed." "That is entirely allowed," he said. He held her carefully, and she let herself be held, which from Ida Carver was an act of genuine trust, and he thought about the kitchen in April a year ago and the flower on her arm and the sentence he had not finished, and he thought that there was something in the way this particular year had arranged itself that felt less like coincidence and more like a kind of grace. The summer was good. The South 40 wheat came in well, not perfectly, because the first year of a soil amendment is always partial, but well enough that the whole crew understood the method was sound, and the second year would be better. Ida's pregnancy proceeded without complication, which she approached in the same way she approached everything else, with practical attention and minimal drama. She continued going to the homestead on Tuesday mornings until July, when the distance on horseback became less comfortable, and after that she transferred her Tuesday morning ritual to the good chair by the east window of the main house, where the light was right and the quiet was hers. She read everything she could find about what to expect, which in 1875 in the Texas Panhandle was not as much as she would have liked. Mrs. Alvarez, who had 5 children and considerable experience, was a more practical resource, and the two of them had a series of conversations in the kitchen in August that Elijah was not privy to, but that he gathered, from the expression on Ida's face afterward, had been both informative and reassuring. Dr. Hannigan came from Tascosa, because Elijah had written to him in July and confirmed his availability for November, and because on this particular matter Elijah's thoroughness was operating at full capacity, and he was not leaving anything to chance that could be managed by preparation. The child was born on a November afternoon, when the first serious cold front of the season was coming in from the north, and the sky outside the bedroom window was the color of pewter. It was a boy. He was healthy and loud and had, as far as anyone could tell in the first hour of his life, a very strong opinion about the whole situation. Elijah sat beside the bed and held Ida's hand and looked at the baby lying on her chest, wrapped in the blanket Mrs. Alvarez had made, and felt something that was beyond the language he normally used for feelings, something that was large and very quiet at the same time, like standing at the edge of a landscape that was larger than your expectations of it. He is very certain about things, Ida said, looking down at the baby with the most unguarded expression he had ever seen on her face. Open and wondering and deeply, deeply glad. That is a good quality, Elijah said. I suppose it is, she said. She looked up at him. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she was tired in a way that was profound, and she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his life. I was thinking William, she said, for a name, if you have no objection. William Crawford, he said. I have no objection. He paused. William Thomas Crawford, if you want him to have something of his. She looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were bright. Yes, she said. William Thomas Crawford. She looked back down at the baby. That is his name. He stayed beside her through the evening, while the cold front arrived and the wind came around the house, and the fire was built up in the bedroom fireplace, and the lamp burned low. Mrs. Alvarez came with broth and bread, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the three of them with an expression that was the domestic equivalent of a general surveying a well-conducted campaign. Good, she said, which was her highest form of praise, and went back to the kitchen. The winter passed warmly, in all senses of the word. William Thomas Crawford was a vigorous, interested child who had opinions from the start and communicated them without reservation. He was also, as it turned out, remarkably placid at night, which Mrs. Alvarez said was a mercy, and which Ida attributed to Patterson, because she had taken the baby out to the barn on 3 separate occasions in the first weeks when he would not settle. And the mule's company, the warm, large presence of him, his absolute unconcern with the state of things, had worked each time in a way that no one could fully explain but everyone accepted. Patterson is useful after all, Elijah said one January morning, watching his wife carry his son through the barn toward the mule's stall. He has always been useful, Ida said, in the tone she used when she was correcting something that she considered a matter of factual record. He was just useful in different ways. The South 40 wheat, planted again in the spring of 1876 with the fully established Ash Amendment, came in excellent. It was the best wheat Elijah had seen grown on Crawford land in his lifetime, and he had a photograph taken of the field. He rode to Tascosa specifically for this, bringing the photographer out by wagon, which the photographer seemed to find more adventure than he had bargained for, and he had the photograph framed and hung in the main house in the room where Ida kept her books. She looked at it for a long time when he hung it and said nothing, which was her version of being very moved. They added to the ranch that spring, purchased the adjacent parcel to the north when its owner, old Marcus Birch Henry's father, decided to move closer to Tascosa to be near his daughter's family. Henry, who was now 17 and had been working for the Crawford Ranch on weekends and summers for the past 2 years, expressed an interest in staying on the ranch when he turned 18, and Elijah told him that there would be a place for him if he wanted it. Henry said that he did want it and shook Elijah's hand with a seriousness that was both younger and older than 17, and that was settled. Ida's second pregnancy announced itself in the summer of 1876, which she reported in the same way she had reported the first, standing at the stove, not looking at him, in the carefully composed voice. But this time there was less fear in it and more of the joy coming through unfiltered, and when he turned her to face him she was already smiling. "Another one," she said. "Another one," he agreed. "I think Patterson will be involved again," she said. "Undoubtedly," he said. "He will want to be consulted." The second baby was a girl, born in February of 1877, named Clara Jane Crawford, which had been Elijah's mother's name, and which Ida had decided on in September without telling him, presenting it the evening after Clara was born as a fait accompli. He had looked at her for a moment, and then at the baby, and then he had had to look at the ceiling for a moment for reasons he did not try to explain. William Thomas, who was 2½ and had opinions about everything, inspected his sister with the thoroughness of a property assessor, and declared, after some consideration, that she would do. This was considered a generous review. The homestead on the East 40 remained Ida's, and in the spring of 1877 she began something new with it. She had been writing letters all winter to the Kansas farmer, to the agricultural extension that was just beginning to operate out of the land grant program, to a professor at the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas, about the Ash Amendment method and its application to alkaline soils in the Texas Panhandle. The professor wrote back in March with a letter that was 4 pages long and asked very specific questions, and Ida wrote back with answers that were even more specific. And by May, there was a genuine correspondence in progress that she took very seriously, and that Elijah found genuinely thrilling to observe. She was systematizing what she had done by instinct and experience and reading, making it rigorous enough to share. And the homestead was where she did the test plots small, precise, with records kept in a notebook that was rapidly filling up. He built her a proper writing desk for the homestead in April, from good pine, with a shelf above it for the journals, and she received it with the controlled but genuine gratitude that was one of his very favorite things about her. Henry Birch turned 18 in the spring and came on full-time, and he was good, steady, and observant and willing to learn, the kind of young man who made a crew better by being in it. Cutter Banks, who was not given to enthusiasm about people as a rule, said that Henry had good instincts, which meant Cutter had basically adopted him. Dora Banks, she had taken Cutter's name without apparent sentimentality about the exchange, started a kitchen garden at the foreman's cottage that she ran with the same efficiency she brought to everything else, and she and Ida had a running comparison of notes on growing times and soil conditions that was productive for both and occasionally competitive in a way that Cutter and Elijah found privately entertaining. The ranch grew. Not fast, not rashly, but steadily, the way things grew when they were properly tended. Elijah bought the northern parcels and the water rights associated with them. He improved the bunkhouse and hired 2 more hands. He replaced the original fence on the south perimeter with a proper cedar post installation, which Des and Henry did together over 3 weeks and took enormous pride in. The South 40 wheat was in its 3rd full year and was reliable enough that he had started selling a portion and planning the 4th. The household was full of life that was, by its nature, sometimes difficult and always worthwhile. William Thomas, at 3, was a force of nature who had Patterson's stubbornness and his mother's precision, and a laugh that he deployed like a tool. And Clara at 1 year was still deciding who she was, watching everything with enormous dark eyes that held, Elijah thought, a quality of assessment that he recognized from the porch in September a year before he was born. One evening in late summer, after William Thomas had been put to bed and Clara was asleep and the house was in its quiet mode, that particular quiet that houses with children have after they are down, which is a different quiet than no children quiet, fuller somehow, more occupied, Ida put down her book and looked at him across the fireplace. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was very afraid the first time you rode up to the gate," she said. "Not of you exactly. Of what you represented, the last version of loss." She looked at the fire. "I had lost Thomas, and I had nearly lost the homestead in the court proceedings, and I was holding everything I had with both hands, and I could feel it wanting to pull away." She was quiet for a moment. "And then you came up to the gate, and you sat there on your horse, and you smelled the bread, and you just stayed there. And something about that, the fact that you did not come straight in with your legal papers, that you just sat there, I thought, this person is not sure what he is doing either. And that made it possible to ask you in." He looked at her. "I was not sure," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what made it possible." She picked up her book again, then set it down again. "I wanted you to know that, because I think about that morning sometimes, how close it was. A different man would have come to the door directly and read his papers and left, and I would have had to leave by October, and none of this would have been." "But you still would have asked him to sit down first," Elijah said. She looked at him and smiled. "Yes," she said. "I would have asked anyone to sit down first. It is only polite, a pause. But I am glad it was you who sat down." He moved from his chair to hers, which was not large enough for 2 but managed anyway, and she put her book on the side table, and he put his arm around her, and she settled against him with the ease of long practice. And outside the window the Texas night was doing its enormous thing, the stars and the dark and the distance. And inside the stone house, it was warm and full and entirely sufficient. They had a third child in the spring of 1879, another boy, named Robert Daniel Crawford, who arrived with the same vociferous opinions as his brother and none of his sister's watchful assessment, and who Patterson the mule regarded with what Ida described as weary but genuine affection. William Thomas, who was 4.5, accepted his new brother with the condescending generosity of the established, and Clara, who was 2, was delighted and said so repeatedly in the nonverbal emphatic fashion of 2-year-olds. Henry Birch had his own small stake by then, a corner plot of the east acreage that Elijah had sold him at a fair price, and extended the payment terms on, because Henry was as reliable as bedrock and the kind of person you wanted to have equity in the operation. He was building a house on it slowly, with help from Des and Cutter on weekends, and he had been seen twice in the company of a young woman from Tascosa named Pearl who worked at the millinery shop, and seemed, from what anyone could observe, to regard Henry Birch with cautious but increasing interest. Des had gone north to Colorado in 1878, following an opportunity that Elijah had helped him identify and given him a recommendation for, and they had parted with mutual respect and a standing invitation for Des to come back if Colorado did not suit. The bunkhouse had 2 new hands who were solid and young, and being trained up in the Crawford operation's particular standards, which Cutter Banks administered with the patience of a man who understood that good habits had to be built from the beginning. Ida's correspondence with the Agricultural and Mechanical College of Texas had evolved, by 1879, into something more formal. She had provided them with 3 years of documented results from the homestead test plots, and the professor she had been writing to had cited her methodology in a paper published in an agricultural journal that winter. She received a copy of the journal in the mail and read the citation 3 times without expression, and then put the journal on the shelf beside the Kansas Farmer of 1869 and did not mention it again, which meant it was very important to her. Elijah mentioned it at dinner. "You are cited in a scientific paper," he said. "I am aware," she said, cutting bread. "Ida, what would you have me say?" She looked up with that suppressed smile. "That I am pleased, I am pleased. It is useful work and it deserves to be documented." She handed him the bread. "I would like to expand the test plots next spring." "Of course," he said, "whatever you need." "I will need Patterson to cooperate," she said. "Patterson cooperates with nothing," he said. "He cooperates with me," she said. This was true and inarguable, and he let it rest there. The last of the major legal matters was resolved in 1880, when the Western water rights dispute that had been simmering in the county courts since 1875 was finally adjudicated in the Crawford Ranch's favor. Garrett, who had grown his practice considerably in the intervening years, and who had developed a particular professional satisfaction in representing the Crawfords, because their cases always involved interesting research, brought the news out to the ranch himself. Elijah read the judgment with Ida beside him at the pine table. They were at the homestead that Tuesday morning, as was the habit, and when he set it down she put her hand on top of it and said, "Good, now we can plant the West Creek field." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I could see it in your face when you were reading." He looked at her. She was 32 now, and the years had settled into her the way years settled into a person who was doing the right work in the right place. There were fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting at the sun in fields and laughing when things were funny, and her hands were capable and weathered, and she moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had decided, early and permanently, that she would not be unmade by it. She was the most substantial person he had ever known. He thought that most days about many things, and it was always true. "Ida," he said, "yes, I want to tell you something." She settled back in her chair with her coffee cup, which was still the mismatched set from the homestead's early days. She had refused to replace them on the grounds that they were perfectly functional, which was accurate, and looked at him with attention. "I have been thinking about the original morning," he said, "the April morning when I rode up to the gate, and I have been thinking about the sentence I never finished." "You were going to ask me to leave," she said, without accusation, simply as a fact. "I was going to ask you to leave," he confirmed. "And I want you to know that I am," he paused, trying to find the word that was precise enough for what he meant. "I am grateful. That you asked me to sit down first, that you made coffee, that you showed me the agricultural journal and talked about the soil and made me stay 2 hours when I had come to be finished with something instead of starting something." He looked at the shelf of books, the Kansas Farmer, the professor's paper, Middlemark, the Bible with its worn spine. "I did not know what I was lacking until I found the thing that filled it. I think that is common enough. But I do not want it to be unremarked on." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Patterson made a sound from his stall, not the parsley fence-breaking sound, but the ordinary companionable sound of a mule who was content with his situation. Clara's voice floated from somewhere in the garden, where she was conducting one of her characteristic investigations of the world. Robert had been set on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon and a pot, which was absorbing him entirely. "I knew you were not a hard man," she said. "Not in the way some of them were. You sat there on your horse and smelled the bread and did not come straight for the door, and I thought, this is someone who can still be stopped by something that is not duty." She looked at her coffee cup. "That was the thing I was counting on when I asked you in, the fact that you could still be stopped by bread." "That is a kind analysis of a man who came to evict you," he said. "I am a kind analyst," she said, "when the subject warrants it." He reached across the table and she met his hand in the middle of it, and they held each other's hands across the scrubbed pine table in the kitchen of the homestead that was hers, built by her and Thomas, and made full by her particular careful industry, in the middle of a spring morning in Texas in 1880, while their children played and their mule held opinions, and their wheat field stood ready. Through the spring and into summer the ranch operated at its best capacity yet. The West Creek field went in with a mixed planting that Ida had worked out over the winter, based on both the alkalinity work and a separate set of observations she had been making about the creek's seasonal water table. It was ambitious, and Elijah followed her lead on it without reservation, because following her lead on land matters had proven over 6 years to be among the better decisions he regularly made. William Thomas, 5½, had decided he was a rancher. He followed Cutter Banks around on Saturday mornings with a focus that Cutter found both flattering and exhausting, asking questions about cattle with the relentlessness of a person for whom information was a primary need. Cutter answered all the questions with unfailing patience because he was, whatever his outward manner suggested, a man who took the future seriously, and the future of this ranch was walking 3 feet behind him asking about branding. Clara, 3, had decided she was a botanist, though she did not have the word for it yet. She had a small basket that she carried everywhere and filled with interesting specimens, leaves, seed pods, rocks that had features she found significant, and she deposited them at her mother's feet with the regularity of scientific tribute. Ida examined each specimen with genuine attention and named everything correctly, which Clara recorded with great satisfaction in the private filing system of a 3-year-old's mind. Robert, 1, was conducting an ongoing study of gravity and the properties of various objects when dropped from various heights, which was alarming to observe, but suggested a scientific rigor that Ida regarded as encouraging. On a clear August evening, when the wheat was in and the accounts were settled and the children were asleep, and the ranch was in the particular state of ordered completion that only arrived a few weeks each year when everything was done and nothing was pending, Elijah and Ida sat on the porch of the main ranch house and watched the last of the light go out of the western sky. Patterson was at the homestead, as he usually was. He had never fully accepted the main ranch's accommodations, and Elijah had long since stopped insisting. The horses were in the stable. The hands were in the bunkhouse. Cutter and Dora were at the foreman's cottage, a lamp burning in the window. Henry Birch's new house was visible from here if you looked northeast, which Elijah often did, with the satisfaction of a man watching something he had helped build become its own thing. "The West Field will be ready to expand in spring," Ida said. "I know," he said. "I want to write a full paper this winter," she said. "Not just correspondence. A proper paper with documented methodology. The professor has been encouraging it for 2 years." "You should," he said. "You have the material." "I will need time," she said, "which means you will need to manage Tuesday mornings." "I always manage Tuesday mornings," he said. She glanced at him. "You always ride out to the homestead on Tuesday mornings to make sure I am not doing something alone that I should not be doing alone," she said. "That is managing them," he said. She made the sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh but was uniquely hers. He loved that sound. He had a private list of sounds and expressions that were entirely hers. The half-laugh, the measuring look, the way she said his name when she had decided to be direct, the expression she had when the real laugh got out. And he added to this list without intention, simply by paying attention to her, which he did because she was the most interesting person in any room he was ever in. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask it. Are you happy?" She turned to look at him. "I mean to say, are you happy in the way you needed to be, the way you were not before?" He thought about the answer with the seriousness it deserved, about the evenings of accounts in the stone house and the wrong kind of quiet, about the 3 times he had turned his horse around before getting to her gate, and the 4th time when he got as far as the gate and the bread stopped him. About the stone he had moved, and the seeds they had planted, and the hand across the pine table and the September porch when he had stopped being sensible. About William Thomas learning the names of every cattle breed from a man who took the question seriously. About Clara's basket of specimens and the careful names for all of them. About Robert and the wooden spoon and the inexorable logic of gravity. About the South 40 wheat, productive now, established, solving a problem that had been given up on as unsolvable. About Ida Carver, who had become Ida Crawford on a September afternoon 6 years ago in a small church in Tascosa, with flour sack curtains in her old kitchen, and a mule with opinions and more practical knowledge about alkaline soil than anyone in the county, and a laugh that she had, over the years, become less careful about keeping controlled. "Yes," he said. "I am happy in exactly the way I needed to be." She looked at him for a moment more, and then she settled back in her chair and looked at the evening sky, which was doing its ordinary miraculous thing, and he looked at it with her, side by side in the August night, with the ranch around them and the children inside, and the field standing ready and the whole long future of it still being made. The sentence he had come to deliver that April morning 6 years ago had never been finished. He had never once felt the lack of it. Some things, he had learned, were better replaced than completed. And the best of them began with sitting down and drinking coffee across a scrubbed pine table from a woman who was not afraid of her own mind, while the bread cooled on the windowsill and the mule formed opinions in the barn, and the land outside stretched wide and open and waiting to be known. He had come to ask her to leave. She had asked him to stay. Neither of them had ever looked back.